Welcome to another episode of the Impro Pod podcast. My guest today is Pete the Temp, who is a poet, author and entertainer. Welcome to the podcast.
Very happy to be here.
So tell me a bit about what you do, what kind of poetry you perform.
I write about everything and all of the above, and I publish it in a variety of different forms. So I'm a words man, essentially. So sometimes I write books of poetry, sometimes I write non-fiction books and turn them into performance lectures. I do kind of stand-up poetry shows, spoken word theatre shows. I sing in a band called Pete the Temp and the Vibe Mechanics. Lots of different methods of publishing, but my main love and my main devotional practice is language. Recently I did a show called Romantics, Mystics and Revolutionaries at the Arnold Feeney for the Lyra Festival, which was an absolute joy to do. And that was a history storytelling show, performance lecture about the 1790s and revolutionary England and the lives of these two poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge. And we talked about psychedelic testing and all of these different things that were going on, the history of riots, accompanied by keys and a cello. And that was an incredibly gratifying way of transmitting history storytelling. Really beautiful experience.
Well, history of riots. Wow, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, Bristol's got a great history of riots, yeah. And a great history of riots ahead of it, I'm sure.
So to add to the Impro Pod map then, a prominent moment from the upcoming marriage story takes place in Beckworth's antique store in Hertford, UK. The story about the off-putting tattoo parlour takes place in Soho in London. You can check out the map, which features the approximate locations of stories and guests, at impropod.com. So I'm going to play you a piece of improvised music.
Great.
And I'd like you to tell me what it makes you think of. That means like anything that comes to mind, sort of thoughts, emotions, ideas. Don't analyse it too much. So just first impressions, what does this mean to you? So what did you think of that?
Beautiful. I was in deep black space and there were these forms arising and just almost like epiphanies. They didn't seem to necessarily be part of a structure. They were just arising and fading away. It reminds me there's certain Buddhist meditations where you imagine yourself in infinite blackness and thoughts arise and thoughts just dissolve into nothingness. And then these chords came in and then it suddenly went down into my lower abdomen and I just felt like a ground had appeared. And suddenly it had this kind of emotional kind of landscape to it. And suddenly it had this depth and this dimensionality that it didn't have before.
So infinite space and nothingness.
Yeah, it's not creating a landscape so much, it's creating space. That repetition, it's almost like a drone. The interval between those two notes gave a minor, slightly uneasy feeling, flavoured it. Very suspenseful and atmospheric.
I'd like you to tell me a story of some kind, and I'm going to break the story down into sections and improvise a soundtrack to the story.
The story that I'd like to tell is a very inspiring and fascinating and beautiful story about a man called Simon, who sometime, I think it was in the early 70s, went to a New Year's Eve party with his older brother Tim. There he met a young woman also in her early 20s. And something started to happen to him that had never happened before. And he started to realise he was falling in love with this person he'd never spoken to and didn't know anything about. So he started to speak to her. And she was there with her boyfriend. It transpired that they weren't actually that serious. One thing led to another. Soon they're dancing. And that night on the dance floor, he tells her that he loves her. And the boyfriend clocks them together and turns to Simon's older brother, who happened to be there, and said, who's that guy there? And Simon's older brother was like, oh, no idea. Lied, covered his brother's back. That night, this lady left, and Simon said to her, listen, I'm going to find you. I'm going to come to where you work, and I'm going to find you soon. And the next morning, he woke up with a hangover and the realization that he had neglected to ask her where it actually was that she was working. All that he knew was that she worked in an antique store. So 2nd of January, when the shops opened, he started to go to every antique store in Hertfordshire looking for this woman. Meanwhile, this woman is sat at home wondering if that was all just a dream and if she would ever see him again, was beginning to try to put it all behind her. And on the 3rd of January, Simon walked into Beckwith's antique store in Hertford, and there she was. And he walked over to her and he got down on one knee and he said, will you marry me, Caroline? And she looked at him and she said, I'll have to think about this, and my name's not Caroline, it's Catherine. And he looks up and he says, I'm sorry, you can't think about this. And she says, why? Now, when Simon went home from the New Year's Eve party, he went home with his brother. His brother said, listen, if you're going to propose to this woman, you can't take a maybe as an answer. You have to be propositional. You have to take a risk with this. And this was the 1970s, right? So their models for masculinity was like James Bond, right? So anyway, he said, I can't take a maybe for an answer. She said, why? He said, because in 5 days' time, I'm moving to South Africa and I'm going to live there and study hyenas. He was a zoologist. And I want you to come and help me and live with me as my bride, study hyenas in the outback of South Africa in the savannah. And she's like, okay. She'd left school at 15 and was working on her dad's farm. And this was kind of like one of the most exciting things that had ever happened to her. So Catherine, as it turned out was her name, agreed to marry him, this man that she spent only a number of hours with. And she said, well, I'm going to have to introduce you to my dad. So they go and they meet her dad. And Simon says, listen, I'd like to marry your daughter. And he says, no, you're not. Who are you? They get chatting and turns out that Simon's dad actually knew her dad. They were both in farming. So he's like, okay, well, let's get a wedding together. And all the family rallied round. Catherine phoned her now ex-boyfriend and told him that he was now her ex-boyfriend and she was going to get married. He was a bit shocked, but laughed about it. And he was invited to the wedding as well. They had about 3 or 4 days, I think, to get a wedding together in a registry office because the flight was already booked for South Africa. They booked her a flight as well. And on the 7th of January, they had a wedding and it was a beautiful occasion. The press were invited. The Sun newspaper even covered the event. I've seen the photographs. He had an 8-inch afro, huge, ridiculous haircut. The problem was that there was a weekend between the marriage proposal and the wedding, so there was nowhere open where he could have his haircut. And then the day after the wedding, Simon took Catherine to meet his mother, who was in hospital, actually dying of cancer. And she got to meet her new daughter-in-law, and the following day, she died. And on the 10th of January, Simon flew off, and Catherine was a day or two behind her on a separate flight and flew into South Africa and was met by a friend of Simon who met her and accompanied her to this little hut in the savannah where her husband, that she'd known only for a number of hours, was waiting for her. And they lived in the savannah and they studied hyenas. And after a couple of years or so, they had their first son, Tim. A year later, had their second son, Ian. And then a few years later, they had me. And last year, we celebrated my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. And they're still very happily married.
Wow, quite a story. Don't take this the wrong way, but it could have gone horribly wrong.
Could have really gone horribly wrong. Yeah. I think they spent 10 hours together.
And so musically then, because there's quite a few kind of cue points, if I was to focus on one or two, what do you think that could be?
I wonder whether the moment of arriving into the antique store might be some sort of like turning point. There's almost a kind of like a moment of zero gravity there. I'm kind of hearing some held up in the high register. Yeah. And then it just collapses into some sort of congruence where it's actually, okay, then it's a yes.
So I'm going to go for that moment in the antique shop because he's been to so many different antique shops. Right. So there's this probably sense of like maybe wonderment, maybe relief. And then it's the proposal and this sense of urgency, but also that you can't really think about it. This risk, quite a big risk she's got to take, or she takes. She doesn't have to take it. I'll try and get a sense of that. And then what you were saying about the high notes, sustained, and then going into what was the word you used?
Congruence, moment of falling into some sort of harmony. I'm feeling something chordal and deep, lots of different colours. That was really beautiful to listen to. I'm just sitting here with my eyes closed, just marinating in that. It's just really incredible to hear a kind of rendition of a story that I'm very close to, put into musical form with the movement and the colour and the shapes that evokes in one's mind, in one's body, in a way that words can't do. There was a moment where it almost felt like it was being pinched up to some sort of polarity. It was all just being pinched up to a single moment, right about halfway through. And then it had this kind of tumblesome quality. The marriage is coming, and then just like there's a yes, and all of these things. And talking to my parents, it was the feeling that they were caught up in some current. There's some trajectories of history just feeding, and then there's the point of convergence when the two lines come together, and there's nothing that you can do to stop it. And then those chords, there's so much colour to it, greens and purples and blues and reds and yellows. My father has Parkinson's disease, so we're aware that we don't have an infinite amount of time. So it's really nice to do this as a homage to their story. I used to be part of the Oxford Imps. This is a little rabbit hole. I'm just going to go on and come back to the point you've made. The Oxford Imps is the Oxford University Improvisation Society. One of the things that we were trained in there is, as an improvisatory principle, take bold decisions and roll with it. And if your improvisation partner makes a bold decision on stage, you don't butt it, you yes and it. You roll with it and you go with it and you accept it. You make a proposal, you make a bold decision. And in that song, it came in the form of a high note, and it really kind of stood out, and it was very pronounced. And from that just changed and re-inflected the whole where it went from there. That was how I would interpret that moment.
And I changed key quite obviously to something that's quite different. It's like new reality. It's harmonious, but it's different. And I was really imagining that antique shop. I was imagining the dust. When you have an antique shop and everything's been there for so long, like you've given up dusting it. Not like I ever run an antique shop, but I imagine it's like that. Like the dust becomes part of it. I was imagining the light coming through the windows, but the sort of dusty sunlight. I was trying to get a sense of the bell. Some shops have a bell to tell when the customer comes in.
This is interesting for me to hear because it becomes almost semantic content in what you're doing with sound there. It's denotive of particular things, not necessarily literal because you're not naming them, but you're creating with sound an environment. You're landscaping by soundscaping. Then it becomes almost like a meditation or a hypnosis. You're creating an environment, you're creating a space. and populating it with things in real time. I don't know if you have an imagistic mind, whether you're picturing an antique store when you're playing that.
I was picturing antiques, so sometimes the image, not particularly in that case, but it is exaggerated the way I picture it. Weirdly, it works one way. I'll sometimes struggle to picture images from music. So if I listen to a piece of music, I'm trying to struggle to get an actual image from it in my mind's eye. But if I'm playing the music, then I can think about an image fairly easily. So I'm thinking about the image more than the music, but like letting my musical intuition interpret it. When I was improvising that piece, I'm thinking of an image. So I'm thinking of that atmosphere in the antique shop. I'm thinking of that more than the music. And then I'm using my musical intuition to sort of interpret it without actually thinking about the music. I don't really like thinking about what to play.
If you started to go into the minutiae of what you're actually doing and trying to make conscious decisions, you're not in the antique store any longer, are you? You're not in flow because it's a different circuitry of the brain.
Yeah, it's true. You're getting to the analytical, need to get this right part of your brain, the logical part, which does play a role. I mean, sometimes I think about, oh, that's C major 7. That would be nice here. Let's try that. Or I quite like these sort of chords, jazzy, open kind of sound. But my brain will sometimes it will just give me a shape. So when I'm playing, I'll just think of that shape.
Okay, so when you say that, you're holding out your hands, which makes me think that this is like your embodied cognition.
So would you like to tell another story then?
We could try another story, yeah. I think about 10 years ago, I was in Soho. There's all these kind of like bohemian back streets in Soho and these kind of sweaty tattoo stores. And I was looking to get a tattoo done. So I went into a tattoo shop and I went up this narrow stairwell in this bustling urban back street. A lady opened the door. She said, just wait here. And I was waiting there. And there was this guy who was waiting and he gave me a nod and he was waiting behind me. And then after a few minutes, she opened the door and she let me in. I thought, they must be busy. And she ushered me through to this room. And I was like, this is a bit seedy, this tattoo store. I'm not sure I want to get something done here. I looked at the kind of bed and it was a bit dirty. And I'm like, it's not even really well decorated. And then I saw on the wall, there was a sign and it said, hand job 25, full sex £50, anal £80. And I realised I'd walked into a brothel. And just as I clocked this, the door creaked open and an Eastern European lady walked in half naked and she said, hello. And I was like, instantly went into this bumbling English, like apologetic mode, stammered something about being sorry and how I have to go, got my coat and then just like awkwardly walked out and passed her out of the brothel. And she would look really confused, not knowing what the hell had happened or why I was leaving, or maybe quite offended. So yeah, that was my attempt to get a tattoo.
So to start with, I'm going to get a sense of Soho, set the vibe, maybe something a bit jazzy, and everything's good. And you go into this tattoo parlor and you go up the stairs. And then I'm going to try and get a sense of this, something's a bit off, something's a bit strange. You're not quite sure what's going on here. Bit of intrigue, bit of discombobulation. And then, of course, the moment when you realize it's actually a brothel. And this quite polite but swift exit. Okay, here we go.
I think you captured Soho there. Yeah, that you've got a kind of cultural reference point there by slipping into a particular genre, which set a scene. And then metaphorically for me, it went up the stairs, and then they were in the room, in the brothel. And then it was these kind of high notes again. So it's got a definite beginning, middle and end, this, because you've got Soho leading up to the room, and then you've got in the room, and then this moment of, again, this kind of suspension, this zero gravity moment. You've got these high notes, and then it's discordant, and it doesn't seem to be, the confusion seems to be mirrored by the fact that you weren't in a particular key, or it didn't seem to be going anywhere, and didn't quite know what it was doing, almost, the song. For me, is how I'm interpreting it. I could see that very staircase again. I could see me running back down it and just going off. And then you just have this little kind of like comic ending, just to kind of just say, look, that was absurd. And then you go, oh, that's nice, got a little kind of story out of it. Yeah, really interesting. Again, it's almost like there's a kind of, they call it the narrative arc, don't they? You go up to the top of the mountain, and then you come back down the mountain. You're not the same person that went up the top of the mountain.
So what did you get out of this podcast?
I've never been part of a meta conversation about improvisation before, which I find really fascinating. That is the act of discussing improvisation in and of itself, because it weirdly deepens the stories. By telling the stories musically, it then brings up new questions and new insights about the actual stories that we're having. And it brings some emotionality into it as well, because this is why we have music. It speaks to us from a very ancient, very deep place. As they say, where words fail, music begins. Maya Angelou said, people will always forget what you said and what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. There's something that music does to a story, and that deserves homage. For me, this is an act of homage, having this conversation to the stories that we're telling, and also to music itself, which for me is something I care a great deal about. Metaphysics is intimately linked to improvisation. So if you look at existence, from beginning to end, you've got phenomena arising and passing away. Nothing is permanent, everything's in flux, everything's in change constantly. What remains eternally is imagination, creativity and play. And astrophysicists and wisdom traditions and every mystical tradition that has ever existed, they all, at the heart of their mystical tradition, have contemplated on the musical, improvisatory nature of existence as a creative process. I would say that improvisation is an organising principle of existence. And we see this now. It's summer outside, it's June here, it's been raining in England, everything's so green, the days are long, and everywhere you go, you just see this incredible green epiphany exploding all around you. The Fibonacci sequence dancing and unfolding and unfurling itself. And to divinize the mundane phenomena, whether or not you're into metaphysics and notions of God or whatever, to allow these metaphors in, even just as an act of enchantment. For me, a tendril is the pinnacle of God's imagination. And a flower, the unfoldment of a flower, is a musical, epiphanic, convulsive, beautiful outfoldment of cosmic imagination. It's everywhere we go all the time. The incarnation of divinity is every moment and everything. Theophany, bringing of the divine into the manifested phenomenal world. It's happening all the time. Jamming, universe jamming itself into being. It's incredible. And these are not my ideas. I actually have a quote here I'd love to share with you from Inayat Khan, who in the early 20th century was perhaps more than anybody responsible for bringing Sufism into the West. So it started with music, and he would gather crowds through music, and then he would start giving talks about it, and he would describe his work here. Practicing the music, I had reached a stage where I had touched the music of the spheres, and every soul became for me a musical note, and all life became music. Now, if I do anything, it is to tune souls instead of instruments, to harmonise people instead of notes. If there is anything in my philosophy, it is the law of harmony, that one must put oneself in harmony with oneself and with others. I have found in every word a certain musical value, a melody in every thought, harmony in every feeling. I played the vina until my heart tuned into the very instrument. Then I offered this instrument to the divine musician, the only musician existing. Since then I have become his flute, and when he chooses to play his music, people give me credit for the music, which is in reality not due to me, but to the musician who plays his own instrument. So we see this idea recurring again and again, mystical traditions, that human music grows out of the music of existence, like an orange grows out of a tree. It's a very old Sufi trope that music is a simulated reality. It's a message from beyond the veil, from the beyond. And we see the deep structures of the universe at play in a kind of perfected immaterial realm. Form, harmony, shape, structure, embellishment, improvisation, repetition, balance, weight, colour, brightness.
Thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been an honour to talk about these things and to work with such incredible musicians such as yourself. So thank you for having me.
Is there anything you want to promote?
If people are interested in my words, you can find me on Instagram. You can find my music. Pete the Temp and the Vibe Mechanics is on Spotify. We have an album on there, and I've had other albums. I have about 15 years worth of comedy and music and poetry on YouTube, different playlists on there, all under the Pete the Temp banner, like temporary.
And we're also going to be performing at Shambhala.
We will be at Shambhala, yeah. You're going to be our honorary keys player for Pete the Temp and the Vibe Mechanics.
Yeah, look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Join us next time for another episode of Impro Pod.
Yeah.